in this darker blue. So again, I'm not going to ask you to draw this map, but I do expect you to know the details about those terrestrial biomes. So for example, something I might ask on a test. If I asked you about the tundra, what would I expect you to know? This is the level of detail I expect. I would expect you to know a sample location, one of them, such as the high latitudes of Asia. I would expect you to be able to describe the climate in a sentence. Something like, it's extremely cold and dry. We find permafrost there. The soils. What type of soils do they have? Well, they're organic rich. Plants. There are no trees, but it does have, you would have to say, either grasses or mosses or lichen to get the mark. And for animals, you'd have to say a sample animal might be a muskox, a lemming, or an Arctic hare. Okay, so that's the kind of detail I'd expect on the test. So, the biomes, page 154 to 159. Again, you are responsible for the various details of these aquatic biomes. So, aquatic biomes can be divided into 3 different types. Freshwater, or continental biomes, things like lakes, rivers, and marshes. Lake Ontario, for instance. Transitional biomes, like estuaries, this is where saltwater and freshwater mix. And marine biomes. Examples of that would be continental shelf biomes, open ocean biomes, coral reef biomes, hydrothermal vent biomes. Okay? So some of the terms that we apply to biomes of the aquatic realm. Within the continental, you see the lakes and rivers, swamp and marsh. Within the transitional, we talked about them being estuaries. The marine, however, has a whole bunch of different categories. Open ocean, zones of upwelling, continental shelf, algal bed, coral reef, thermal vents, littoral marine, continental shelf or slope benthic, and abyssal benthic. There's details about these in your textbook. You are responsible for them. So, again, like I did for the tundra, on a test, what level of detail would I expect from you? Well, if you chose coral reefs, or if I offered you the choice, coral reefs, as a sample aquatic biome, I would expect you to tell me a sample location, somewhere in the tropical waters. Don't put tropical waters, put a particular sample location. Climate, physical setting, such as temperature ranges between 18 and 30 degrees Celsius. An example of a plant, coralline algae, for instance. An animal, you could pick one of mollusks, foraminifera, corals. And the importance. What are the importance of coral reefs? Well, you could pick that they protect the shore from coastline erosion. They supply calcareous sediment. Any of the details that you find in the textbook. This is the level I'd expect. Biomes. So the aquatic ecosystems, there are 2 major groups of organisms. Benthic, those are the ones that live on the bottom. These are the ones I study in my work. Things like corals, bivalves, worms, and crabs live on the bottom, benthic. Another type would be pelagic. So you can be either benthic or pelagic if you're living in the aquatic ecosystems. Pelagic guys, instead of living on the bottom, float or swim around. These include 2 different types. The first type would be phyto and zooplankton. Example, diatoms, forams, algae, pteropods. And the second type being nekton, like fish and whales. These guys are bigger. You can see these guys that are phyto and zooplankton are very small. Nekton are still pelagic, just like these guys, but they're big, like fish and whales. They tend to eat these stuff, the phyto and zooplankton. Phyto and zooplankton. Here's an important diagram from your textbook. I've seen it show up before. Okay, it's showing you where those different biomes that are. The estuary ones, and then the marine ones. Okay, so transition, marine. And it's showing you the depths. Pelagic, guys that are floating around out there, and the benthic, the ones that are living on the bottom. I like that one. So let's look at one sample. Coral reef biome. That's where we saw our description before that I expected you to know. Okay, when you're talking about the biotic components of life on Earth, you cannot help but discuss extinctions. What is an extinction? That is when the very last members of a species die, so there's no more parents left to pass on their genetic traits to the offspring. So an extinction would be a plant or animal or whatnot that's no longer around on Earth. There's never going to be any more, like dinosaurs. So over 90% of all species that have ever lived on this planet are actually extinct. I found that quite unbelievable. During the Phanerozoic eon, there's a mention of your geologic time scale. During the Phanerozoic eon, 6 major global mass extinction events have occurred. These mass extinction events represent sharp decreases in biodiversity. So we talked about biodiversity being really important. Each time there's a massive extinction event, biodiversity is suffering a huge hit. So you can see that these 6 events are between the Cambrian Ordovician, between the Ordovician-Silurian, between the Devonian and the Carboniferous, between the Permian and the Triassic, between the Triassic and the Jurassic, and between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary. So you should be able to tell me how long ago the major extinctions happened if I ask you that. So the most important extinctions are the Permian Triassic, which was 245 million years ago, so in between the Permian and the Triassic. This is the most devastating mass extinction event that we know of. Loss of about 55% of marine families. About 55% of marine families were lost between the Permian and the Triassic. The other most major extinction, Cretaceous Tertiary, about 65 million years ago. This boundary marks the dinosaur extinction, most people are familiar with that, and a loss of about 11% of marine families. So the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction was the end of the dinosaurs and also end of 11% of the marine families. The Permian Triassic was 55%, as you'll recall. So despite these mass extinction events during the Phanerozoic, the variety and number of life forms has actually reached an all-time high during the last 10,000 years. In terms of living species, so far we've actually identified 1.4 million living species on Earth. The total number of living life forms is estimated to be between 5 and 30 million. So we've identified 1.4 million, but we expect that there's between 5 and 30 million. If you look at this chart, which is kind of cool, you can see that there's about 1,000 viruses, about 5,000 Monera or bacteria, 27,000 algae, 31,000 protozoa, 69,000 different types of fungi, 250,000 higher plants, 280,000 other animals, such as vertebrates. There's 41,000 different vertebrates, for example, and they belong in the other animals category. And for the insects, 750,000 different types. That's incredible. So you can see very easily from looking at this chart that most of the different living species by group are insects. They're more than 50%. This is percentage along the side from 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, more than 50 for those insects. I would not expect you to reproduce these numbers. I would expect you to realize that there are way less viruses than higher plants, than insects, this kind of relationship, but I would not ask you the number of living fungi species by group or anything like that. So we're talking about biomass. We have to talk about total biomass, dry mass. So 1,250 billion tons of biomass on Earth. Only 0.3% of that is found in the ocean. Okay? Imagine how much of the Earth the oceans cover. You know that from previous lectures. Only 0.3% of the biomass on Earth is found in the oceans. Okay, so I put a little note on there. I do not expect you to remember the details of the numbers, only the relationships between them. So when you're looking at this diagram, for the ocean, you see that purple areas do not have a lot of productivity as you go all the way up to the reds, which do. And on land, the blue areas have